Well, today I have William Louw, a leading immigration specialist and tax practitioner from Sable International, with me in the studio to unpack the increasingly complex system South Africans face when they choose to immigrate, whether permanently or temporarily. Hi, William. Thanks again for joining us.
Hi, Linda. Thanks for having me.
Well, I've read the document that you sent me, and you've highlighted several structural flaws in the current immigration system, and especially for taxes. So what, in your view, are the most critical weaknesses?
The thing that I think has happened is that Treasury has decided how they want certain systematic structures played out, and SARS and the Reserve Bank are getting confused as to how they should link everything, and they're trying to overlap into each other's realms and causing confusion by using terms which, quite frankly, I don't think they should be considering, and they should be almost staying in their lane to say, let's look at how we deal with our structure. We can maybe use the other department to assist in doing certain things, but let's just make it easier for the taxpayer to deal with their affairs, either from exchange control or tax purposes.
So for people who are going through this painful process or might be going through it, what happens? Do you have to liquidate all your assets?
No, you're not meant to. The problem is that the way SARS and the Reserve Bank have structured their systems, it's basically forcing people or individuals who leave the country to actually consider liquidating everything because it becomes too painful going forward to work with the two departments and leave assets behind, which is a big problem, and I think it'll damage the economy.
Can you take us through the steps that somebody needs to take if they are immigrating?
So the first thing you need to look at is you need to tax immigrate out of South Africa, which is the application with SARS, where you tell SARS, I've left on X date. These are the assets when I've left. I pay my exit tax. I then get a letter from SARS confirming that I'm a non-tax resident, which will then change that SARS is aware that they've got limited taxing rights from my worldwide income streams and assets to my South African sourced income streams and assets. So that's all fine. One of the complications with SARS, however, is that they don't fully understand the difference between tax immigration via ordinarily residence, physical presence, or the double taxation agreement. They seem to think that all of them are once-off effects, which is not the case. Each one has their own aspect in the law, and a double taxation agreement is only applicable where South Africa would see you as tax resident under local legislation, as well as the other country sees you as tax resident under their legislation. And then the governments have agreed to say, although we each see them as tax resident, we will now decide who's going to be the tax dominant country, and the other one defaults to a non-resident, so it's easier to manage your tax affairs. So for somebody who relies on the double taxation agreement, they have to evaluate annually whether their tax status has changed from or to South Africa, and it can change year on year by a simple decision which you don't forecast, and then suddenly you find that you've changed your tax status without intention with all its effects, and that's a big problem from the SARS side. The Reserve Bank, in their opinion, have decided that although they're meant to be controlling foreign exchange for South African residents under Home Affairs, that they're bringing in the tax terms into play. So basically what they say is that if you have a South African ID and living in South Africa, you're exchange control resident. If you have a foreign passport but are living in South Africa and have residency to stay in South Africa, then we'll see you as a resident and allow you to utilize the same banking system. But now they've added the extra complexity to say that if you've tax immigrated out of South Africa, even if you're a South African ID holder, we will see you as a non-resident for exchange control, which basically means you have to convert all your bank accounts to non-resident bank accounts. You lose access to certain allowances, and it gets very confusing. Now, the biggest problem with this aspect is that if you tax immigrate under the double taxation agreement, under local laws, you're still a tax resident, but SARS says that you're a non-tax resident, which means the bank is going to change you to a non-resident, restrict your allowances, while you still have intention to stay in South Africa and still have a lot of assets in South Africa, which makes life very difficult.
Well, it's so complicated. I mean, how do you make sense of that?
You don't, and that's why I think they should go back to their core, and the Reserve Bank should rather say, are they a South African ID holder, yes or no? Are they a passport holder who lives in South Africa, yes or no? To make it easier to manage those cash flow events. I can understand them wanting to limit certain transactions out, but they don't have to bring in tax terms and tax changes to do that control. Treasury has also said that they want to try and relax exchange control, but what has happened now with the Reserve Bank is they've actually tightened exchange control. And if you have left South Africa and you're facing all of these headaches, quite frankly, if it was my decision, I'd probably just rip everything out of South Africa because I don't want to deal with all the red tape. I don't want a situation where the bank has now classified me as a non-resident, frozen my bank account, and I cannot access my money. And the only way for me to fix it is to get a piece of paper from SARS saying that I'm a non-tax resident, which can take 6 months after I've left. And in the interim, the only other way to unlock my bank account is either come back to go see the bank to unlock it, or get this letter so that they can maybe unlock it, and it just causes havoc. We're having a lot of cases like that with people who approach us where they've got businesses in South Africa, they're passport holders or ID holders who are living outside the country, and their bank accounts are being frozen and they cannot pay their staff.
It seems it gets down to the definition of immigration. So if you do what you said, have you actually immigrated?
Well, immigration should only be where you give up your passport rights, which is to live in the country. It's got nothing to do with tax, got nothing to do with exchange control. And they need to look at what those definitions are and don't muddy the waters between the two of them, the three of them actually. Treasury just gives guidance, and then Home Affairs controls your passport in and out the country. Tax controls what taxing you have to pay, what reporting you might have to do, but exchange control should just be how do you move your money in and out the country? Are you allowed bank accounts, yes or no? And that should be linked to the people who are resident in the country, which would normally be people who are resident for passport control, as well as foreigners who've got a foreign passport who are living in the country because they've got permission from Home Affairs to live in the country. Otherwise, you're just going to confuse everything and make everything so much more difficult.
So what's your position if you say, well, I'm just going to work somewhere else overseas for a couple of years, and a couple of years later, I will return. But that turns into decades. What is their position?
So likely there you're going to tax immigrate out of South Africa, but because you're going to work abroad, you might still leave a life in South Africa. And then if you have to close or convert your bank accounts to non-resident bank accounts, then how do you keep your life in South Africa? A lot of people leave the country, they still have bank accounts in South Africa, they still have property in South Africa, they have their pensions and their RAs, sometimes they continue contributions to those, and now all of a sudden the Reserve Bank says, no, we're now going to make your life difficult, so you can't keep those assets going. A lot of South Africans, I believe, go abroad, they're working, their plan is to come back to South Africa, maybe 5 years, maybe 20 years, but while they're working abroad, because they know they want to come back to South Africa, they're building up their asset base and life in South Africa for the return. With these changes with the Reserve Bank, that is being blocked, which means that the economy is losing out because you're not getting investment from South African ID holders back into South Africa. At the moment, you're getting more investments from people who have foreign passports to invest in South Africa, and now they're starting to have difficulty, which means are they going to leave the investment in South Africa?
So do you think the Reserve Bank's treatment of non-tax residents is actually unconstitutional?
I believe it might be. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to say yes or no definitively. But if you look at what is happening, you have a South African ID holder who's living outside the country versus a South African ID holder who's living inside the country. And then you've got a passport holder who's a non-resident living inside the country. So the person who's got the most rights, South African ID holder living in the country. The person with the second rights is a foreign passport holder living in South Africa. Then after that, you might even find that a foreign passport holder who's not living in South Africa has more rights than an ID holder living outside of South Africa. And how can that not be unconstitutional in my little bit limited knowledge?
Why do they make it so complex?
I'm not sure. I think they're just controlling to try and minimize cash flow out of South Africa. But what they're doing with this method is they're actually persuading people to start taking all their money abroad. You've even got situations where somebody who's retired abroad and they get a living annuity from South Africa or pension from South Africa, now they're having difficulty getting that money out of South Africa just because the exchange control says they may not send it out abroad and they may not use their single discretionary allowance. Some items they have to use an AIT or authorization for international transfer. That, however, is an application to move capital out, not income. Income, according to the Reserve Bank, should be easy to move abroad if you can prove that you're non-resident and you can prove that as income. However, they're making it so much difficult to move those funds out that foreigners can't easily move the money abroad, which means that it is likely to want to invest in South Africa.
So what benefit is there in for the government? What kind of taxes are they managing to levy?
It has no tax impact. That's the problem. If you're a tax resident, you pay tax on your worldwide income. If you're a non-resident, you pay tax on your South African sourced income, which would normally be your dividends, your interest, your rental, your living annuities, and similar. Certain double taxation agreements give those taxing rights to other countries and not to South Africa. So the exchange rate, by blocking the money leaving, doesn't change what taxing rights SARS is allowed to have.
So if the government wants to make the immigration process fairer and more predictable, what simple fixes would you suggest?
Well, as I said earlier, I believe that they should look at, for exchange control, who is allowed to have bank account, and having a South African ID, I would think, would allow you to have a normal South African bank account. You might have certain limitations on borrowings. That's something different. But to have a bank account and be able to use it, it's fairly easy, and that's what I would do. For SARS, they just need to tweak their systems to understand better what is actually happening, look at how they want to deal with certain things. For example, if you tax immigrate out under a double taxation agreement, well, they will still see you as a resident for exchange for tax purposes in South Africa, but in the tax return, they can ask, are you applying for relief under a DTA? Please give us a proof that you've got the taxing rights in the other country, so we can tax that you as a non-resident with its implications. And then the following year, they can do the same thing to say, are you still a non-resident or not?
So, William, do you think these policies discourage people who want to come back to South Africa to reinvest in the South African economy upon return?
Well, a lot of people are not going to invest in South Africa before they return. They might only invest once they return. But at that stage, if you've built up your life and all your asset planning outside of South Africa, by moving back to South Africa, it's unlikely you're going to change that system, because foreign systems allow you to keep the assets where they are. So why would you change it? Which means you're only going to bring in what you live off. So there's less money inside the economy. And all that investment is still outside. So how are you going to build South Africa's economy like that?
Just seems absolutely complex. And, the question is, what is South Africa gaining by it?
I don't see there being any real gain, because the economy needs investment. And the best way to invest is actually using South Africans who move abroad just to get knowledge and experience to come back and develop. Now, you have situations, for example, that South African might move abroad, working there, start a sideline business in South Africa, start employing people in South Africa for the return, so they've got a nice business running. With the Reserve Bank blocks, that now is being more difficult, which means it's less likely to happen, which means you have less investment in South Africa, which means there's less growth, less employment. So actually you lose employment with these policies, I think.
You mentioned the tightening of exchange control. I've recently spoken to an economist the other day who says with cryptocurrencies, it's quite easy to take money out of South Africa.
Well, that might be part of the reason why the exchange control is trying to tighten things, because they cannot control the crypto. But in the big world market, money flows very easily. You need to foster the right environment for people to want to invest in which case then you don't mind how the money leaves or comes in, because the investment will stay here. If people get huge returns, they're going to leave the investment where it is. Though they might have the option to take currency out using crypto, it's not going to disappear that easily. Crypto is going to be the same worldwide. And at some point, I'm pretty sure there will be some sort of oversight over crypto, because it's going to have to happen. So why chase the money out until that happens, and then you've got nothing because everybody's outside? And why would you want to change the system? Why would you want to invest where you're not comfortable?
Anything you'd like to add, William?
I just wish that certain people would listen and think about the structures and the impacts that they're having, because it sounds like the Reserve Bank is not thinking about this. SARS has not spoken to tax practitioners who deal often in certain aspects of niche markets, and I think that they are misunderstanding or losing track of certain options that might be happening and how to streamline things between SARS, the tax practitioners, and the taxpayers. Because if that runs smoothly, it's easier to collect your taxes and everybody's happier, everything happens faster, there's less frustration, in which case then people are more likely to invest back in South Africa.
Well, I guess that's where it comes to the services that you provide. This process is so complicated, it would be hard to navigate on your own. William Louw from Sable International, thanks so much for speaking to us.
Thank you, Linda.